Thanks everyone for thanks everyone for tuning in again. Today I'm going to talk about the issue of state of good repair. Now I did bring this up in my first, and I think it was the first video that I recorded and uploaded. I think it's a Biden's infra, or Biden infra. Yeah, it's this thing. So it is uh okay, good, you're not. This is a really bad freeze frame. So one of the things that I complained about is that the original proposal, which at this point is almost 3 months out of date, and they're talking about compromises of compromises and new meetings, and I have no idea what's even going to happen with this. Is that of the original proposal, 2/3 of the modernizing rail bit, so 50, I believe it was 55 out of $85 billion, we're going to go to something called state of good repair. And I explained why I think state of good repair is bad, but I want to focus on that a little bit more this time because the state of good repair issue just isn't going away, I'm afraid. And unfortunately, it's also something that a lot of the older generation of reformers, so let's call them Gen X rather than geriatric millennials, are very focused on. So there's this mentality that expansion leads to unfunded mandates. Expansion is at the expense of maintenance. Expansion is a kind of growth scam. It's a very common belief about urbanism in general within the strong towns community. And with infrastructure, there's this kind of focus on something called fix it first. It's considered a forward-thinking way of having better infrastructure. It is, in fact, the opposite of that. And I want to explain first why it's bad, and second why people believe that it is good even though it is bad, and third what this means about transport advocacy. So the first thing is why is state of good repair or fix it first such a bad thing? And uh, the story of this has to start in New York in the 1970s. So New York City in the 1970s is a city in crisis, and I'm gonna see if I can find good things on nycsubway.org about this because that's an excellent website that I heartily recommend. I'm pretty sure this was also the thing in the previous week's upload. The words hardly and heartily sound too similar. I don't hardly recommend it, I heartily recommend this, cordially, or whatever. It's a really good website about the state of the New York City subway. And they have histories of various eras of the subway, including the historic American engineering record of the beginning of the subway, which is an excellent social history of late 19th century and early 20th century New York. Now, more recently, so they say recent and mean post the main period of growth, which ended in 1940. So they do have something about the 1970s and the 1980s. I recommend that people read this. So in the 1970s, the city was in crisis. The crisis of the city was, so they talk about the deferred maintenance initiatives that started in the 60s. Now, to some extent, this even goes a little bit farther back. I mean, there are certain things where the maintenance was never proper, but for the most part, this is something that really accelerated in the 70s. So they just talk about the state of the New York City subway in the 70s, so they talk about the slow zones. They talk about the R44 and R46 cars, both being defective, and the lawsuits against the vendors because they sold New York City Transit defective product led to the exit of both manufacturers, the St. Louis Car Company and Pullman, from the industry, which was kind of the coup de grace for the American rail industry. And the and they Let me see if they talk about the mean distance between failures. Is it working now? Yes, but not well, because this is not good. I'm going moving. Okay, it's working. Great. Yeah, I can see I can see I can see from this whether the audio is working or not. Um, Yay, I like being audible. Anyway, this is going to be my excuse for just talking on the OBS applet for far too long. But anyway, the point is that in the 70s, the city was in crisis. So they talk about the crisis of the subway, but this was also a citywide crisis. Um, so we can look at the population of the city. That's actually the best way of seeing it in just one set of statistics. So uh, here. So the city grows rapidly from settlement to the early 20th century, and then it keeps growing more slowly in the 30s and 40s. There's a little bit of decline in 50s suburbanization and recovery in the 60s, but overall population in this era is flat, and then it goes from almost 8 to barely 7 million. It takes until 2000 for the city to recover to its previous peak population. And just in case it's somehow unclear, just because current growth is weak as well, this is not because they didn't build enough housing and as a result, people were displaced. No, the city was very poor. Today, the city's population is becoming richer relative to the national average as high rents displace the poor from the city. And rents are very high because the city is desirable for people of means, and the amount of housing is fixed, leading to displacement. Now, in the 70s, they didn't build housing either, but it's not because, I mean, there was also tight zoning already starting in the early 60s, but that's not why the city was in crisis. The city was, people just didn't want to live there anymore. It was viewed as a hotbed of crime. And I don't mean like how today people think that the city, that the 70s crime rates are back. I wish that people look at the crime rates in the city. Yes, murders are somewhat up, but this is the overall crime rate, and usually the complaints about how the police has been abolished come from people who talk about burglaries. So burglary rate, overall crime rate, which is dominated by theft, so that's grand larceny. Yeah, and even murder, the stuff that's up to some extent. This is the murders in 2020. This was up over 19. This is the murders in 1990. And in the 70s, and basically the murder rate was pretty constant from the 70s to when it started declining in 1991. So yeah, this is so in the 70s. This is the murder rate in the city. The maybe the rape rate. I don't even know if the rape rate was higher or lower, just because it was even more underreported than it is now. But but the situation was, I mean, people were fleeing. The media about the city was something like escape from New York, rather than the place that's like somehow too rich for its own good mentality of today. So the city was in crisis. It didn't have money. And so maintenance suffered because that's the easiest thing to skimp on, because if you skimp on maintenance for a single year and then you recover in subsequent years, you're going to be okay. If you don't pay the bus drivers for a year, you're not going to have bus service that year. So maintenance is very easy to skimp on. This is also something that was done in the private sector um, throughout American railroading in maybe the 60s and 70s, leading to various crises and bankruptcies. This was also done in Deutsche Bahn, actually, in the 90s when they were trying to make it privatization ready. And so so it's something that's very easy to do, and this came to a head when by 1980 trains broke down every 10,000 kilometers in New York. If your commute is a distance of, let's say, 10 kilometers, uh, maybe let's say 50, it's 10, maybe 15 kilometers. So you're going on the subway 20 to 30 kilometers every day. And you probably only ride it to work because it's the 1970s and everyone is afraid of riding the subway off peak. And you probably are working in Midtown or Lower Manhattan. The state of centralization, I think, was actually more centralized then than now. My understanding is in the 70s, you work either in your neighborhood or in Manhattan or in Midtown or in the Manhattan core to some extent. Everywhere to everywhere commuting was already a thing, but much less than it is now. So, so it's usually long commutes, let's say 15 kilometers each way. So, 30 kilometers round trip. And if you only ride weekdays, then you ride what, 7,500 kilometers there every year, and 4 months you see a train breakdown. If you live a little farther, you see a breakdown every year. This was visible, and the trains were also, remember, very slow because so much of the system was under 10 miles an hour slow restrictions. These slow restrictions being very popular in American railroading as well as urban mass transit as a kind of safety theater. If they think that the state of the tracks is poor, instead of fixing the tracks, they will put a 10 miles an hour speed limit and hope for the best. So they began a program in the 80s under Richard Ravitch called State of Good Repair, which program included things that are today viewed as standard in the city, like or in the region, like 5-year capital plans. And Ravitch was also very anti-boosteristic about the system. So he would openly talk about how the system desperately needed money and was in a very poor state. He was not trying to portray the system as doing better than it was because his political goal was to secure funds for state of good repair maintenance. And so he needed to portray the system as in very poor shape, which it was. At no point was he lying, by the way. And so this was a success. So state of good repair, I need to emphasize again, it is a bad thing, but it is bad but it is bad while at the same time the program of New York, I don't want to say New York City because the MTA is a state agency, the program of the MTA in the 80s and 90s was a smashing success. By 2000, the mean distance between failure was not 10,000 kilometers. The mean distance between failures I don't know if in 2000 proper, but by the time I moved to the city, so 2006, the mean distance between failures, system-wide average, on the subway was on the order of 200,000 kilometers. The 10 miles an hour speed restrictions were gone. The trains that I started riding, I can tell you the average speed of the trains that I would ride because I rode them so often. The one train would average 5 blocks per minute south of 116th Street. A block is 80 meters, so 5 blocks a minute is 24 kilometers an hour, which is on the low side by global standards, but don't forget the local trains in New York are some of the most densely spaced in the world. So, for example, Paris is comparable roughly to the local trains in New York. It has, on the trains that are not automated, roughly similar average speed, something like 25 kilometers an hour. And now, this was an improvement over speeds in the early 80s. This was visible to passengers. Other things were visible to passengers. For example, there was a much lower crime rate. The graffiti was gone. The physical state of the stations was better. Now, if you're in New York, or if you visit New York, there are certain stations that you might notice look horrible. So I think the most notorious example that I'm aware of is Chambers Street on the JMZ. And I'm actually going to see if they have good photos on this site. Maps, lines, cars, behind the scenes, home. Let me see. Let me see if they have images, just because. Because it's not something that I'm telling you that nobody knows. It's something that most people in New York or even mildly familiar with the subway, certainly all rail fans, would know. Let me check Chambers Street Station, and if I can't find, then I'll just ask you to believe me. So it's on the JMZ. There are a bunch of stations named Chambers Street for those unfamiliar with New York. Station by station, Chambers Street. So here's how it looks. There are parts of it that look worse than the decaying tiles. So again, this is a bad photo. The station is worse than the bad photo. And 40 years ago it was worse, and passengers noticed that things got better. Yeah, and it's yes, this is one of the worst stations in New York City, and I say this. So in Berlin, I live on. So I'm not going to give you my exact address. I eventually going to need to post an impressum, and that will include my address. But I can tell you where I roughly live, and where I roughly live is around here. On U8. So Heinrich Heine Straße is one of the last nice stations in the city. And the ones that flank Hellenplatz are also really bad. So Schönlein Straße, I think, is considered one of the worst stations in the city. I've been there. You notice that it's somewhat crummier than stations that, for example, have elevators. This and also Heinrich Heine. These are two of very few stations in Berlin that have no elevators and no wheelchair accessibility. So you notice that these stations are kind of crummy, and these stations are better than the average station in New York City, let alone Chambers Street on the JMZ. So the point is that the state of the infrastructure was visibly very poor 40 years ago. By 20 years ago, it had visibly and noticeably improved. Now, it didn't improve back to where it had been before in certain aspects. For example, train speeds. Trains, even before the great slowdowns of the 2010s, were slightly slower, especially in the express trains. So I think the one may not have been any slower at the time I lived in the city, so '06 to 11, than it had ever been. But there are certain trains that were slower. So, for example, the straightaway of the ABCD between 125th Street and 59th Street, on which segment they run nonstop. So it's a very long nonstop segment. It might. I'm not sure if it's. So it's definitely the longest within Manhattan. I'm not sure if it's the longest within the city. It is from around here. It goes frip, so it's not quite a straight line, but close enough. So it's a 5.4 kilometer section on which so there are lots of stations, but they're all local. The express trains do this nonstop, and and I know that the trains are slower than they used to be. Like when I say used to be, I mean before the 70s. But again, this was a market improvement over the 70s and early 80s. So this worked really well, and this turned into a proposal to kind of do a state of good repair nationwide, and that flopped because nationwide, for other systems, there was nothing like the situation of New York City in the 70s. Instead, it turned into a game of deferring maintenance and then crying poverty as soon as money becomes available. Amtrak, this is my favorite example, so I know I've mentioned this in multiple videos. Amtrak, in the Bush era, was under pressure to post paper profits. They didn't tell them why post paper profits, they told them post profits. Um, and they were incapable of doing so, for example, because of very high operating costs, for example, because of a dysfunctional root structure. And so they did so by trying to defer maintenance. And in fact, the head of Amtrak at the time, David Gunn, refused. He said, Amtrak is like the national parks. Nobody asks if the national parks make money. I will not make Amtrak profitable through maintenance deferral. No. He was fired as a result and replaced with a more pliable leader named Joe Boardman, who deferred maintenance in the pursuit of on-paper profitability. Not achieved back then, but I think Amtrak is very close to achieve, or was close to achieving that on the eve of Corona. Um, and then the Bush-Obama transition happened, the financial crisis happened, the stimulus happened, and Amtrak suddenly found itself no longer facing a government that was trying to stop subsidies to it, but on the contrary, was speaking favorably of stimulus and infrastructure. So what did Amtrak do? It asked for $10 billion for a state of good repair. $10 billion, there were far more than it had ever skimped on maintenance for, and it's not because spending $1 in maintenance now means you're not going to spend $10 in maintenance in the next 5 years. Preventive maintenance is good, but it's not. But it's not 1 to 10 within. Uh, but it's not 1 to 10 within 5 years. Good. Um, and so the incentives were suddenly to ask for things without anything to show for them. And this is why I emphasize that SOGR succeeded in New York because visible improvements happened because the city was in such poor shape that people could notice the improvements as they were happening in the 80s and 90s. And no such thing happens with Amtrak, for example, or with other systems that cry for state of good repair money right now, like BART in San Francisco. They're not saying, give us money and we will have faster trains that you can see as riders. They're not going to say, give us money so that we're going to have more frequent trains that you as riders can notice by reading schedules or by saying that you just wait less for the trains. They're not going to say we're going to have more reliable trains, which you riders are going to be able to see because you ride them and you notice that the intervals between trains are less variable. They don't say any of that. They say, give us money for a state of good repair. They do not ever subject themselves to any kind of external confirmation. In effect, state of good repair ran into the overexpansion problem that is so common, where sometimes systems expand beyond their ability to maintain the system. It's a thing that sometimes happens. You build the first line of anything, a subway system, a high-speed rail system, anything really, and it succeeds very often it succeeds. Often it succeeds beyond everyone's imagination. Not always, but usually these sort of systems that expand very aggressively are ones where the first line was a smashing success. If the first line was a failure, you will just not hear of it again, and they will not expand more, or they will barely expand more. So, for example, the Shinkansen in Japan, the first line Tokyo to Osaka was a smashing success. Now, bear in mind that the year it opened, '64, was also when JNR stopped making money. But the Shinkansen made money. JNR was losing money on branch lines and local lines. So they kept expanding. And some of the expansions were very good, like from Shin Osaka to Fukuoka. But they also had some expansions that were not so good. So when they went from Tokyo north, first of all, they didn't go all the way to Tokyo until '95. They went to the suburbs or to Ueno. And second, one of the lines, the Tohoku line, so it's this one. Sorry. So this one was pretty good. At the time, it went to Sendai and then up to initially Morioka, but now it's going up to Shinaomori and Hakodate. But they also had a separate line that they knew from the start was never going to make money. It's called it's not the Takasaki line. Takasaki line is the parallel commuter line. It's called the Juetsu line, and it goes up to Niigata. It was known to be a money loser. The prime minister, I think, was from the area and wanted to subsidize his home region. So they overexpanded. No, don't get me wrong. The Shinkansen right now is profitable, but that required big cuts in operating costs over the 1980s and 90s, involving also the breakup and privatization of JNR. So that is an example of overexpansion, and it's I think very easy to think about overexpansion in terms of physical expansion. You build a line, the line succeeds. You build more lines, they look like they succeed, but you don't have enough money for regular maintenance, and as a result, the system suffers. And so, and it's a very familiar story. Early success kind of leads to bloat and eventual failure. But this is also something that can happen without physical expansion. It can also happen with institutional changes, and SOGR is one of them. So an early example of success, in this case, New York in the 80s and 90s, leads to overgeneralization of the idea as something that works, and that leads to failure in the 2000s and 2010s through money that goes with nothing to show for it. Even in New York, by the way, state of good repair turned into a black hole. They ask for billions and billions of dollars every 5-year plans, in fact, tens of billions every 5-year plan, much of which is state of good repair, and the backlog never shrinks. And it's not because they don't spend money, and it's not because they say they're deferring maintenance. BART, for all its very real faults, said, we don't have enough money, so we're going to force to defer maintenance if we don't get more money, and we will have bad state of good repair in the future. New York isn't even saying that. New York is asking for expansion, normal replacement, and state of good repair. So the normal replacement bit is this is not me giving the finger, just the order I was doing this. So the normal replacement bit is supposed to ensure that there's no new backlog, and these plans are funded, and yet the state of good repair backlog never shrinks. So it's a black hole, which is very convenient because that way they can sink money into things and never have to show anything for it. It's much easier to spend money without having to promise a concrete thing that will open than to spend money on Second Avenue subway, for example, because then if it doesn't open, people get embarrassed. So this is state of good repair, and this is why it's bad. Okay, it is bad. You should not fund it. You should defund agencies that engage in it. You should fund expansion if you're an outside infusion of money, such as a federal infrastructure bill. And this is not just America. It would be equally true of Germany. I would be very distressed if the German federal government ever funded regular maintenance here, or if the federal government of Canada ever funded regular maintenance, as opposed to just capital expansion with understanding that the agencies in charge are required to fund the operations and maintenance. And so so why do people think that state of good repair is so why do people think state of good repair is good? So state of good repair is bad. So it's always a good question to ask, why are people wrong? The answer is that in the 80s and 90s, state of good repair looked like a success. So part of it is people just living 25 years in the past, or 30 years in the past. And they're considered reformers because these are not people my age even. And I'm 32, I'm 33, I'm like a geriatric millennial at this point. These are not people who are geriatric millennials. These are people who are, let's say, 45, 48, 50, kind of like peak of earning power in American white-collar professions. People who thought of themselves as reformers when they came in 25 years ago, and all of their managers told them, oh, you're really smart, you're going to go far in this agency when I retire, which is going to be never. So these are people who kind of live the world of 25 years ago or 30 years ago. And so that's the first reason. Okay, so first, I mean, it's not down to the cities being bankrupt, it's down to the government just not wanting to get embarrassed by spending money on things that could go haywire, like the airport here. I mean, if you spend money on expansion, it can go like the airport here, and people get embarrassed. If you spend money on refurbishment and don't tell people in advance what the schedule of the trains is going to be to the minute, as is done in Switzerland, then there's less accountability, and an incompetent government, for example, CDU, not just CDU, but CDU is a really good example of this. People have been in power too long, so the 50-year-olds or 55-year-olds who think of themselves as reformers because this is what they thought they were 30 years ago. And so they live in the world of 30 years ago. That's the first reason. But there's also a second reason. And this is something that is related to state of good repair, but means something slightly different, which is fix it first. So both of these slogans, SOGR and fix it first, center maintenance over expansion. And the main difference is that fix it first is mostly a slogan used for roads. Not exclusively, but mostly. And if you read Streetsblog, they constantly ask for fix it first. Why? This is an alliance between several different advocacy communities within the United States. The first is, and the most importantly, is the road advocates. These are people who think spending money on roads is good. Now, these people who are pro-road are not especially competently pro-road any more than political old-timey activism in the United States for public transit is competent. So because these people don't I mean, there is, so by the way, in America there is more respect within the pro-road community for traffic engineers, leading to horrific disrespect for engineers among transit activists, by the way. So I would actually argue it the other way about the tax system here, but ask me about this later, please, Holly. And so the situation is that when you have someone who believes in building more roads but is not very competent at it, they're gonna define themselves by how much money is spent. So you can't tell them we're not gonna spend money on roads because they get mad if you don't spend money on infrastructure at all. They talk about austerity and about how this is American decline, because countries, and not just the United States, kind of sometimes define their national greatness by how much money they spent on infrastructure. Sometimes they even define their national greatness by whether the infrastructure they build is any good, but it's usually more about edifices that make a statement, we have the money to build this. It's kind of the nationalistic equivalent of when a king builds himself a bigger palace. It's just a statement, I have money to build this, and this is a big impetus for infrastructure. And so if you don't spend money on transportation infrastructure, people start making nationalistic arguments about this. And if you build the same amount of infrastructure but build it Green Deal style, so no roads, but much for public transportation, much for trains, then they complain that you're being an environmentalist and that you're doing social engineering. So instead, money must be spent on roads. This is even true of the Biden infrastructure plan, which is very clearly written by people who care about climate change and probably don't want freeway widening too much. Just by how much they talk about electric vehicles and infrastructure for electric vehicles specifically, and they do increase the share of mass transit. Okay, I deleted the link to my old. I closed the tab for my video about the Biden infrastructure plan. But go back on. But if you're seeing this on video, go back and see the link, or just type into YouTube Biden infrastructure plan dissected. The traditional American road to rail split or road to transit split in federal funding is 4-1, and this is being changed to about 2-1 in the 3 months old Biden infrastructure plan. So clearly there are people who care to at least some extent about climate change, but they can't just zero out road funding. So what do? They make sure the road funding goes nowhere. And this is pretty convenient actually for road advocates, because it's not like in most of America there's demand for more roads. Let's say you're in Ohio, okay? So Ohio is a stagnant state. The population of Ohio, I think, is increasing, but very, very slowly. The state keeps losing congressional districts. The historic biggest city in the state is Cleveland, and it's in terminal decline. Cincinnati also. Columbus is growing. It's kind of a newer city, kind of like an eds and meds type economy. But it's not especially quickly growing. Um, so these are not places where there's a lot of traffic. These are not places where there's a lot of demand for road widening, and because the main problem with roads is always capacity. When you build a freeway, if you're the first car on the freeway, you will go on it at speeds of fast trains. Okay, I mean, if you're driving at, let's say, 2 at night, so you're the only one on the road, yeah, you can drive 120 kilometers an hour all the way, which is upgraded legacy rail speed. I mean, you basically don't ever go above that without high speed rail. I think there are like three counterexamples, and they don't ever go much above 120. And so that is so that's not the problem of a road. The problem of a road is that the first car on the road goes at 120, 130 kilometers an hour. The second car also, the 10th car also, but the 100th car doesn't. Roads are limited by capacity. The capacity of roads is very sharply limited, and these are toll-free roads also, so you can't try to ration it through pricing the way they do in Italy. In Italy, the tolls are so high that there are roads where you can drive 200 kilometers an hour. These aren't even especially wide roads. So in Italy, um, I believe it's so I believe it is this road. But maybe I'm wrong and it is this road. So I'm forgetting whether it's the road from whether it's the road from Genoa that gets you direct to Milan, or if it's a different road that gets you. I'm forgetting to which airport. Maybe it's this road getting you to Malpensa. I'm not sure, but I know that in one of these roads, once you're past the mountains, you can go to 100 kilometers an hour. There are speed limits in Italy. They are pure suggestions. They're not enforced. And it's not an especially wide road. I think it's maybe 2 lanes in each direction, maybe three. So the reason this is possible with, I guess this one is 3 lanes in each direction, is that the tolls keep the road clear. But maybe it's this road then. Again, I don't remember. Okay, so they're both 6 lanes in this part of the country. But the point is that in Ohio, even without tolls, the roads are not especially congested. There's a freeway in Rochester that was recently partly removed called the Inner Loop. I think you can see some of its traces. So this is where the Inner Loop used to run, and you can kind of see that they removed parts of it. And in the middle of the day, people could drive the loop and count the individual cars going the other way because there was so little traffic. People were worried that the traffic on these roads was too fast. Was too fast for safety. They kind of relied on a certain base level of congestion based on the population of Rochester in the 1950s, as a safety modulating system for safety, as a speed modulating system, sorry, for safety. And it was gone because Rochester is depopulated since. So they're talking about removing roads from certain declining Rust Belt cities. And so in a place like Ohio, there's no need for new roads. Remember, the problem with roads is not speed. There's no such thing as frequency on a car. Most of the costs of cars are borne by the drivers, not by the road system. So it's not like you can spend the money on making the cars cheaper or something. And so when they're talking about fix it first, it's just a way of spending money on roads without actually widening roads. What's happening right now is they're spending money on roads. This includes widening roads where there's already no traffic, upgrading interchanges. So the idea is that, so usually when you have an interchange between two freeways, let me see if there's like a normal crossing of two freeways in Ohio. Oh, this one maybe. So kind of the historic way of doing it would be not what they do here. So it's a cloverleaf. And this isn't a cloverleaf. I think there's This looks like it used to be a cloverleaf, maybe. But the problem is that cloverleafs are not very high capacity, so they keep upgrading these to more and more land intensive, more and more expensive things. And remember, this is not a place where there's a lot of, maybe here it's going to be a proper cloverleaf. No, not even here. So note how even in places that are not even the major cities of Ohio, places where there's not going to be traffic to justify this, they keep building fancier and fancier interchanges. They build fancier exit infrastructure. They build bypasses around little towns. I'm trying to remember if this was an example that I actually remember having read from Streets Mob. They build roads that are of no need, that have no need to exist, based uh, yeah, that is that is definitely a thing. But my understanding is that the people who like driving at 250 kilometers an hour, their Porsches on the autobahn at 250, take their cars for a drive on the on certain autostrada in Italy because they are heavily tolled, so there's less traffic and they're also built to much higher standards. Some of them, at least. Um, so at any rate, the point is that those random interchanges that you might see in random places in Ohio don't need to exist, even if you think of car traffic as good. So let's pretend that we are all members of CSU. None of us lived in Munich, of course. Munich is a city for queers and immigrants. We live in the suburbs of Munich. We take the S-Bahn to work every day, and maybe for cultural events. We work maybe in the auto industry, or if we don't, we still think of the auto industry as good. We think that immigrants are a big social problem, but there are limits to where we will go, and we think that AfD are horrible Nazis, and there must never be a legitimate democratic political party to our right. We think of climate change as not quite a hoax. We understand that there's science. We respect science. We probably have a master's degree in engineering or chemistry or something, or physics. But we think that it's probably overblown. And what about the importance of the German economy? And we need to take it slow and certainly not have very strong pollution controls. And we will even find friends who are doctors who will say that EU pollution controls are too strong. And if you think I am being uncharitable, let me find this article. Yes. The Minister of Transport, a member of CSU, sent a letter, and he found doctors, in fact, lung specialists. So in the same way that many of our doctors in Germany are homeopaths, many of our doctors are old-timey right-wing. In fact, I think most of them. And as a result, they think that health fears about vehicle exhaust emissions had been overblown. Our Minister of Transport. I believe he's the least competent member of the government, and I am aware of who our health minister is and what he did. So let's pretend that we're this crowd, okay? We think of cars as good. In fact, maybe we're the transport minister of Germany. We think cars are good. We think that building more roads is good. The health of the nation is based on whether people can drive fast between different cities, whether they can live outside the city, which is full of queers, weirdos, and immigrants, and shop for cheap at Kaufland. If we're like this, we like roads that generate more car traffic because, again, we think that more cars is good. We think that more Mercedes Benzes on the road, more BMWs, more Audis, more Opels is good. Maybe also more VWs, but again, we're CSU, we're Bavarian, we think that the Northerners are kind of lazy. So when we think like this, where do we want to build roads? The answer is where there is the most growth, where there is the most wealth, where it's going to generate the most traffic. So we want to build where there already is the most traffic congestion. In order to, and maybe we are, and we probably are, again, we're engineers or engineer adjacent, we're aware of induced demand. We think of induced demand as good in the same way that, so we think more housing is good, not in our suburbs, and we think of more car traffic as good. So if we think like that, we build roads, for example, around Munich, fast-growing, extremely wealthy city. or maybe between, or maybe we want to widen the roads between Munich and Augsburg and all the way to Stuttgart, from Munich to Nuremberg. Things like that. So we want to build where it's going to generate the most demand. What do we not want to do? We do not want to spend money on roads if it's not going to help with traffic. We don't want to build highways just so that we build just to be able to say we built highways. Remember, we're CSU. We also believe that deficits are immoral and that the Greeks are lazy and need other people to run their budget. If we think like this, we want to not build roads. We don't want to build a bypass around a random town. I'm not saying Germany did that, but we don't want to, for example, look at, I don't know, this random city I just found. I just saw, Bisco, in eastern Brandenburg, and say, maybe there's too much traffic here. Let's try to build a bigger bypass. You can say there's a little bit of bypass infrastructure around it. So these are not at great. This is not an at great intersection. So what we're not going to say is, oh, let's build a beltway around Bisco. We're not going to say, oh, let's build a beltway around where in Turing. What's a good example in Turingen? I don't know, Weimar or Gotha. That's not what we want to do. Remember, if if we're CSU, want to build highways for the benefit of making the road transport network the most efficient, and we define efficient as more road traffic, as people driving more longer distances. When we want to do that, we want to build where there is growth. So, if we're road advocates like this, where do we want to build in America? The answer is probably Texas. Now, there are freeway widenings in Texas. I mean, it's not like the Texans are all morons, so they build outside Houston, so they don't build in Houston, Dallas. On the contrary, they know where to build. They keep widening this freeway going from Houston west, called the Katy Freeway. I think there are parts of it that are 26 lanes, so 13 in each direction. This is how busy this freeway is. It's, by the way, not even the busiest in America. The busiest in America are in Los Angeles, which is underbuilt slightly due to, I believe, construction cost problems, and then in Atlanta, where where you have more lots of traffic because the system is underbuilt, because the state legislature hates the city and wants to see all of the members of the city lynched. Or possibly just disenfranchised, can't tell. And so in Houston, they're not like that. I mean, Texas is very conservative, but they don't hate Houston and Dallas the way Georgia hates Atlanta. So you can see much more freeway infrastructure, and these freeways are very wide. They have very high cost, very high capacity interchanges. Yeah. So for example, things like this is called 4-level interchange. There are 3 of these in Britain, and I believe on the Beltway in Houston alone, there are, I believe, 5 maybe. I think there are 7 in Houston and 7 in Dallas or something like that. So so they spend a lot of money on roads in Texas in order to generate more car traffic, because in Texas they think it is good. The Texans are rather like the Bavarians, except the Bavarians think the deficits are immoral, and the Texans and the Texans think that deficits are okay if the Republicans are in charge. Yeah, so the Katy. Oh, okay. So the Katy Freeway has. So. Oh, so the Katy is just okay. Yeah, so I know that there's a lawsuit. So the issue with the lawsuit is that lawsuits require people to launch them, and so for example, in Stockholm, it's not that there are no lawsuits, it's that people chose not to sue the subway expansion. And likewise in Texas, historically, people thought there was consensus for building roads, so they did not sue road construction. So and now a few Californians who have come in are deciding to sue. So they're suing I-45 widening in order to create more red tape. I don't think they're going to win the lawsuit. The state always wins these lawsuits. It's just delays and extra waste and extra red tape. It's just that Californians have convinced themselves that progress means you sue the government. And so, I mean, the city can argue whatever. I don't think a judge will buy it. And so, the point is that in Texas, the state government thinks that roads are good, so they spend money on where they would induce a more traffic, but that's one state. Most of America is not Texas. So in most of America, they either don't build roads because of very high costs or a left-wing political consensus, like New York, California. They build roads, they widen roads with very little, or they don't have any reason to because of Rust Belt decline or declines of Appalachia, declines in parts of the South. So there isn't much of America where you can actually spend money on roads that induce traffic, that create a lot of extra traffic, extra mobility by car. Again, Texas is a big exception. Georgia would also be able to do that if the state were less racist. Maybe Florida, but most of America is not Texas, Florida, or Georgia. And so already, because road spending is so siloed between localities and states, such a common example of pork, that it's considered normal that it should be spread across states. And in fact, there are rules preventing too much road money from being spent in the same state. I think the rule, I know I'm going to get this wrong, but my recollection is that the rule is that is that they count how much gas tax money is generated within each state, and the money doesn't quite have to stay in the same state. But I believe that I'm forgetting whether a state has to, but I'm forgetting whether at least 92% of the gas tax receipts from each state have to be spent in the state, or at most the inverse. I think it's at least 92%. So you can find one state that you like and spend a lot of money in it by kind of skimming from all the other states, but for the most part, money stays in state. And if anything, Texas is at the minimum. So federal money for roads is disproportionately steered away from Texas. I think part of it is that the costs of construction and maintenance are higher in the north than in the south because of snow and ice. So so money mostly ends up getting spent in places where it does no good, even if, again, we think of the Texan, the Bavarian mentality that cars are great, driving is great, roads are great. And so when we think like this, we don't care about random interchanges in Ohio because the roads aren't congested in Ohio. Who cares? But this money is already being spent. So the kind of road advocacy in America, because of the kind of reality, has no reason to care very much about efficiency, because to care about efficiency means to tell Ohio, no more roads for you. We're only going to build roads in Texas, Georgia, Florida, and a few other high growth or high demand states. So all that matters is all that matters is just being able to say I spent money. So if road advocacy is like this, then you can very easily buy them off by saying, okay, we'll spend money, but not actually build roads. So we'll give you money. The money will be said to go to roads. We're going to call it fix it first. We're going to call it maintenance. We're going to talk about how prudent we are. So we're going to spend a lot of money. And this is kind of buying off the road people. And then you make sure that the roads aren't actually built. Fix it first. There's always going to be some kind of argument that the roads are in poor condition. In fact, road widenings in America, going back to the 1920s, come from engineers constantly arguing that the roads are in poor condition. They just keep escalating the standard. So they used to say 14 feet. So they used to say that roads should be 14 foot wide. Then so that's barely, so cars can't actually pass, or very difficultly. So one of them has to get off the road to pass. And they said, oh, let's do 24 feet, 36 feet. The standards kept escalating from the 1910s really onward. So it's very easy to say, so this is for widening, but this can easily be done for other things. So it's very easy to say the roads are in poor condition, don't ever build again. So this is an alliance of NIMBYs who don't want new things built, public transit and green activists who don't want more car infrastructure, and road advocates who want more money for road infrastructure. So it's kind of an agreement to spend money on roads, but make sure it is all wasted. This is fix it first. And this percolates to transit because because the sort of people who lived 25 years in the past think of state of good repair as a success, because it was a success. Again, it was a success in the 80s and 90s. Don't forget that. This wasn't some bullshit that was made up 40 years ago. This had a reason to exist 40 years ago. The reason vanished 20 to 25 years ago, is all. And so and this was even recognized in New York. The point of fix at first in New York in the 80s, or state of good repair, was to postpone the construction of Second Avenue subway. Then they built Second Avenue subway starting in the 2000s. The money for it was appropriated, I believe, in 2001. And um, so the no expansion bit was gone already 20 years ago, but the state of good repair part continued. So they just accreted more and more money, and now they have enormously expensive 5-year capital plans that, I mean, you give it to a halfway competent person, and I emphasize halfway competent. I mean, you give Paris this, and I mean, Grand Paris Express gets built on like half the timeline. You give Paris that money, and I mean, and Paris has already a transit system that's bigger than New York's. And the metro area is almost as large as New York. So, I mean, that money in Paris, I mean, the stuff that it would, I mean, the sort of crane that it would buy in Paris, the sort of crane it would even buy in London is immense. It's just that in New York, so much of it gets wasted. And I'm not even talking about high construction costs. That's also a thing. Some of it is just money getting wasted without even being spent on capital expansion. And so this is a huge problem with the United States. It's a waste that is probably of similar magnitude in absolute terms to the waste coming from spending $4.6 billion in Second Avenue subway, where it should be 600 million, 700 million. So this is a massive waste. And by the way, if you're asking me about roads in poor condition because of cracks and bridges falling apart. Okay, so first of all, a bridge that is falling, if the bridge is literally falling apart, why is it still in service? That's always the question you should be asking. Now, people are saying, oh, bridges are falling apart. There's the report card on infrastructure in its city. Be skeptical, okay? The same people who are arguing state of good repair will find reasons to spend money on roads as well without anything to show for it. So in New York, for example, this was argued as a matter of urgency to build the Tappan Zee Bridge replacement. So they took the Tappan Zee Bridge, the old one, and okay, I can't tell which of these is this because I know they already demoed the old bridge. I know the way I can tell it, they demoed the old bridge by the way is that I had to read about it. Wait, why are they showing the old bridge in here? This is what gets me because they're saying this is from 2021, but maybe. So I mean, I know I read about the demolition about how they demolished the old bridge in order to write something in World War III real. So they built the Tappan Zee extension, which is this. So it's 2 carriageways. They demoed the old one recently. So they essentially widened the bridge from 7 narrow lanes to 8 wide lanes, which was stealth. It was mostly Andrew Cuomo arguing that it must be done because reasons. Like Andrew Cuomo actually believes in adding freeway capacity. Very few other people in the state do. So he does it to homeopathic extent. So again, going from 7, which really should be 6 lanes, to 8 on a connection that's not especially important. I mean, it's a water connection, so people think it's important. There's not actually that much commuting from here to here. Rockland is way more closely connected to Jersey, actually, than it is to Westchester. But at any rate, this was sold mostly not as an expansion, but as the bridge just falling apart, and it wasn't actually falling apart. It was I think they said that there's not enough redundancy. Again, there's always an argument for building more without anything to show for it. I don't remember. I know that there were steel cracks. I know that there are steel cracks. I mean, but steel cracks sometimes exist. I mean, the state of good repair thing is not going to make the steel cracks less likely because remember, the sort of people who don't want any the sort of people who are promising you that state of good repair will lead is the solution to cracks are also the sort of people who resist any kind of accountability. And here's actually a really good transit example that I'm already on: the New Haven line. The New Haven line has been under reconstruction for maybe 25 years already. It's a 4-track line. And it's possible that in the last 25 years, it has never had all 4 tracks in operation at the same time. People who ride the line are very familiar with the situation happening all the time during weekends, also sometimes weekdays off peak or reverse peak, that one track for a certain segment is out of service. So, and it might even be the local track. So trains go on the express track, and then at the station, a certain part of the platform has metal bridge plates protruding over the out of service local track to permit the express track to platform. And this is with high platforms, by the way. So it's not like people walk down and up. This is all level boarding. So this line is under constant maintenance. Trip times keep increasing. They work really inefficiently. For example, they do not use track laying machines or track geometry machines because reasons. Something that in Southern Europe or maybe in Germany could be done during nighttime closures, maybe not just 3 hours a night. Maybe you need to claw back and tell people that they don't have trains after 11 at night or something. So maybe you need 5 or 6 hour windows. But nighttime windows for a year probably fixes the entire thing to good enough standards that you do New York, New Haven on Amtrak for an hour and very little, maybe an hour or five. This is how easy this is, and yet this line has been under state of good repair, slowdowns, and flagging and whatnot for 25 years. So there's no accountability because it's not like they promise a certain timetable to the minute with something like a deadline, to the point that if the deadline is missed by a little bit, we'll say, yeah, okay, they promised it would take 10 years and it took 12. Or they can say, or it can be a big miss, they promised it would take 5 years and it took 14 years. Berlin airport. And then it gets people embarrassed. They do not want embarrassment. They do not want accountability. And state of good repair, whether it's the transit version or the fix it first road version, is a really good way to avoid having any accountability. This is why people think it is good. So it's a combination of of reformers who don't think of themselves as boomers because they were born in 1970, but they are boomers, who overrate one success case, and it's a success case that's very easy to overgeneralize because it plays to the biases of, first of all, political road advocates who don't mind road money going to something that is called roads, but it is really nothing, and also transit managers and traffic engineers who don't like accountability. This is why something that is bad, which is a state of good repair, is incorrectly viewed as good among people who think of themselves as reformers. Why? Because they're the last generation of reformers. They're the previous generation. They're the ones who think that they're the ones who do reforms for the sake of reform, because any change they think is good because they say the status quo isn't working. So anything that can be sold as a bold change to status quo, fix it first. Federal funding for operating subsidies and not just capital construction. Free transit, I've heard defended on this point. Everything that sounds bold and requires very little technical aptitude, they're game with. And so, with Harry's, yeah. So the potholes, yeah. So fixing potholes is visible. Fixing potholes does not cost money. It costs a little bit of money. I don't think at any point something like the I-45 expansion and fixing potholes are in competition. It's like saying that building a subway is in competition with bus shelter. Bus shelter is an example that is that you can shoehorn into the into SOGR if you argue if you look at the correct boots, but it's expansion. It means improvement in the state of shelter for bus passengers. It is visible. It is severely underrated. This is my this is my post about it. Look for little things that matter bus shelter. So you don't have to trust my calculations, but what is it? What did I say? That if you so the equivalent of $40,000 in capital costs per weekday rider, which at this point is being surpassed by a bunch of things. The marginal lines on Grand Paris Express are above that. I think M18 one cost over on a go was 35,000 euros a rider, so that's $50,000 PPP, and that's an unpopular line. Don't get me wrong, but it's run over and it's still happening. So the argument is that bus shelter should be installed whenever a bus stop has at least 2.5 boardings per weekday. And I have an argument here that Rhode Island, on average, is 6 times that. And their standard is 50. It should be 2.5 based on this calculation, which you do not have to accept. It is actually 50. It is severely underrated, and also look, 3,000 stops, $15,000 per bus stop or bus shelter, and I also think separately that they should kill half the bus stops for stop consolidation. So 1,500 times 15,000, that's 22.5 million. In New York City, there are 13,000 bus stops. Again, you should kill about half of them for stop consolidation. So 6.5 times 15,000, that's, I'm going to get the order of magnitude wrong. It's $100 million. Yeah, $100 million for bus shelter at every bus stop, not in competition with subway expansion that costs billions. And that's not even a matter of subway construction cost per kilometer, because if New York could build Second Avenue subway for $250 million per kilometer, not billion plus, they would have just built the entire thing. So like $4 billion, give or take, was the expected budget for how much the state legislature was willing to give the city from its own money as well as from other sources like federal funds. 4 billion, give or take, was only sufficient for 1/4 of the line. If it had been sufficient for the entire thing, they would have built the entire thing. Remember, the Speaker of the Assembly at the time, Sheldon Silver, reps the Lower East Side. He reps, he's in prison now, I believe. Or I know he was convicted. I'm forgetting whether he managed to get a stay of the prison term. This is his district. He's not even in phase 3. It's mostly phase 4. It was his baby because he believed that it would lead eventually to the construction of the other phases. In 2001, they thought that phase 1 would open 2012, and they would get money for for all 4 phases, and they would open all 4 phases. They would open the last bit by 2020. And so, so well within the lifetime of the boomers who form all of these people's bases, all of these false bases. So it didn't happen, but it was plausible to believe that it would happen. And again, if there had been money for it, because the construction costs should have been, 1/6 what they actually were, it would have been built already. So the issue here is that the amount of money for subway construction, or what the city thinks is appropriate to spend on subway construction, is pretty fixed, and there are already talk about the next things to do. I mean, Bill de Blasio was blurting something about a subway under Utica, which was always considered the next thing to build after Second Avenue subway. Nothing came of it, but he blurted something about it. So that's just going to cost a few $1 billion per project. That is not a competition with bus shelter, which is again citywide in New York, probably 100 million, maybe a bit more. And so this I believe it's the same thing with potholes. It's never in competition with widening roads in very congested environments. And when I say congested, I don't just mean congested in the sense of lots of cars. I mean, let's also say constrained is a better word. So very difficult things like the built-up area of Los Angeles has very high construction costs, some of which are justified, some of which aren't. But I mean, still, it's difficult to widen a road through the urban part of LA, much more so than through ex-urban Texas. So no, fix it first would not work if the money was spent wisely, because the actual things that need fixing cost so much less than the expected budget for roads that fix it first done right is still massive road austerity. Now, it's road austerity that I think is correct. I think they should not be spending much more money on roads, not in the United States, not in Germany, not in any even middle income country. They should be spending money on public transportation. They should be spending money on rail. But the fix it first thing is a compromise between more venal and less competent people, with my view. So these people just don't want roads to be built and don't care about waste. And people who are pro-road but are also not very competent and want money to be spent on roads. So you spend money on roads, but you don't build roads. That's kind of the compromise. So State of Good Repair found ready audience, I think. And this is why State of Good Repair is 2/3 of the Modernizing Rail, or not Rail, Modernizing Rail is my conference. Shouldn't call it my conference, a conference that I'm helping organize, that people wrongly think is mine. Modernizing Transit is the name of the grant. And remember, in the Biden proposal, that was, I believe, 85 bill, of which 55 was going to go to State of Good Repair. So, so this is not just a reform idea that some boomers and who Xers were in practice boomers proposed. It's something that made it to the budget in ways that other not very competent ideas like free transit, like aid to operations, haven't so far. And I think the reason is that it kind of flatters the let's spend money without building mentality with roads as well. So this is why. So this is what it means, really. So this is a bad thing. It is incorrectly believed to be good, and the reason is that it flatters people who don't care very much about results. It flatters people who brag about things that look nice. So they might even be able to point to a specific fix. It empowers people who, but it fundamentally empowers people who mostly think in terms of ribbon cuttings and in terms of the budget, rather than the riders. In the case of road fix it first, it means the drivers, which again I don't think should be empowered, but fix it first is based on the political constraint that money that is said to be spent on roads must be spent and must be the majority of the transportation budget. So again, you can see that they're trying to steer it in greener directions. So things like infrastructure for electric charging stations, but they also include a lot of road fixing because they don't want to be seen as pure environmentalists. Environmentalism is political. The entire idea is to depoliticize and to de-ideologize everything and to turn everything into just who can pay the most bribes. Same way that there are people who, not so much on infrastructure, but on a lot of other issues, just try to figure out how they can bribe Joe Manchin. It's not that there are a lot of openings or anything like that, but it's not a very high quality bridge. In fact, the bridge itself is unpowered. Trains coast, which is something that you would notice if you ever rode Amtrak through it or Metro North, because the head and power, so the lights on the train, briefly shut when you're on the bridge. So it's not a big deal because it's a short section that's unpowered, and for the most part, you're going. I mean, you're not going very fast, but you're going fast enough that it doesn't matter too much. Trains take forever to slow down, forever to stop if you're not applying brakes. And so but it's still kind of a nasty thing. So they want to replace the bridge, which they argue is a matter of state of good repair, even though the bridge is fully sturdy. It's fine. I mean, the problem is that it is kind of high maintenance. Not that these state of good repair projects are paired with concrete plans to reduce maintenance costs in any way, shape, or form. So the idea is to replace it with a high bridge. So you would expect that this, as an expansion, would be bundled into building this alignment, right? Because it converts two short, sharp curves into a wide curve. Trains could go rather fast, especially if the speed limits imposed by the bridge are gone, right? But no, that's not done. The plan for raising the bridge is to build the bridge in the exact same footprint. And I wish to emphasize something. So I believe that I drew this from an actual circle. I'm going to try this again just to be absolutely certain. I think this is 7. I think the radius is about 1800. And drawing circles in Google Earth is not as trivial. So no, it's actually a wider radius. So first of all, note that so a radius of 2,000 meters. If you work the German way, so you don't have tilting trains, but you do the maximum cant and cant efficiency that you can do without tilting. This is 230 kilometers an hour. Which, just to make it clear, is a speed that does not exist anywhere on the Northeast Corridor south of Rhode Island. I guess maybe they finally maybe they finally did the upgrade of the cabinet. Yeah, so it's a curve of radius 2,000 kilometers that takes that essentially takes this tangent and this tangent and goes between them. And you might even notice that there are parts that are even a little wider, the curve, because otherwise this would be shifted a little bit, and I was trying to minimize the shift. I also would like people to see that the extent of eminent domain required for this is minimal. Okay, so you're right next to these townhouses, of which there are very few. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5, 6. So minimal eminent domain. The cost of this eminent domain, even at cost car prices, is tiny. Okay, I mean, all of these together probably go for 10 million, if not. And the bridge is going to be a lot more expensive. The bridge is supposed to be, I think, either a $500 million or $1 billion project. And yet, bundled with this $500 million to $1 billion of a bridge replacement is not a curve fix. They don't think in these terms. So no, small curve reconstructions are not in any way, shape, or form called state of good repair. No, state of good repair is only things that are not actually good. Could they finagle it? Yes, possibly, but remember the whole point of state of good repair is to enable incompetent and venal organizations not to do that. If anything, it's usually the other way around. Money that is needed to expansion ends up going to things that are not expansion. A horrible thing that New York City Transit does is whenever they're given money for accessibility, because New York City hates disabled people, what they do is they spend the money on other things. They also build elevators, but they spend they spend so much extra money on station beautification and removal of graffiti, and somehow with all this money on station beautification, remember what we started with, the way that Chambers Street on the JMZ line, JMZ whatever lines looks. So it's just money getting wasted usually. So it's not like SOGR can be a bête noire for expansions. If anything, the other way around. Expansion is a bête noire for useless things. And by the way, it is entirely legal. I mean, basically anything that you can argue reduces maintenance cost is legal, and electrification, for example, does. But I mean, if I were in charge, sure, I would tell them. I would tell the feds that electrification counts as date of good repair. But I mean, it would not. But if I were in charge, I mean, it would just electrify, knowing that the payback period is within my tenure. So I don't so it's not even something that you need federal funding for. So I mean, assuming competent institutions is doing a lot of work here, because the entirety of this SOGR, I don't want to know to what extent I'm comfortable calling it a scam, but it kind of is. To what extent this SOGR scam comes from bad institutions and by advocates who are used to bad institutions and can't even tell what good institutions look like. And I stress the boomers on this. I don't think it's a coincidence that high-speed rail in America became a really big thing rather than something that three weirdos believed in the 2000s. So I know that, so on the blogosphere, it was Matt Iglesias, of course, and Atreus, actually. And of course, Matt Iglesias became the sort of person who can get an enormously high wage just from Substack, and Atreus, who was, I think, maybe the number 4 blogger in America in 2003, kind of fizzled out. He was too anti-party, I think. It wasn't especially left-wing or anything, but he was anti-party. Like criticizing the party too much for being too. I think it was mostly for being too accommodating of the Republicans, but that morphed into something else. But both of them were, I think, the big early backers on the blogosphere of high-speed rail. And this is something that became really big in an era in which it was okay to say, oh, America is not so good, let's look at Europe. And I think it's maybe related to the Iraq War, because kind of in the Iraq War, there was this idea that, oh, it's okay to look to Europe, which is like a lot of which is like democratic and so on, but like the core of Europe didn't participate in the Iraq War, I think, as part of this. And then you have The Health of Nations by Ezra Klein that kind of says it's okay to look at foreign models, but not too closely, unfortunately. And then there's so I think this is why high-speed rail became a thing. So we're talking late Bush, early Obama era, and to the point that even Bush and, for example, his first Secretary of Transportation, Ray LaHood, even said, "Oh, I envy the high-speed rail systems that they have in other countries. I love America. I love American freedom, but I wish we could have American freedom and Chinese high-speed rail or European high-speed rail." They both said these things in different language. And there was a lot of hope that Joe Biden, because of his connections with Amtrak, would do that. He didn't, and he still doesn't, unfortunately. But this was late 2000s. The 50-year-old set they were already boomers by then. So for the record, it exists better among the Zoomers than it does among the Xers, for example. And the reason is that the Xers, especially in the United States, are too used to bad things. These are not people who. And the problem is, it's also not part of it is not the generation but the age, because in the United States, global knowledge tends to be something you acquire at a young age and then forget. So so it's very common to learn a foreign language in high school or in college and then forget it because you don't practice. So in the United States, for example, bilingualism is not education loaded. Even in Britain, let alone in France or in Germany, it's not. I mean, these are not bilingual countries, but bilingualism tends to be an urban and then it tends to be urban and educated more than anything. In the United States, it's mostly for second-generation immigrants. Sometimes it's because they're more. Sometimes it's because they're more. Sometimes it's because they're more educated, but they don't have to be. So if anything, in the United States, it's negatively correlated, because in the United States, maintaining your parents' language when you're a second-generation immigrant, tends to be correlated with lower levels of education and lower levels of assimilation. This is why, for example, second-generation Asian Americans maintain the language much worse than second-generation Hispanic Americans, because Hispanic Americans have way lower education levels than Asian Americans. And again, it's something that you can even kind of see a little bit with levels of assimilation. I mean, I think the only place where you see a lot of maintenance of the Spanish language with even moderate levels of education, are a handful of places with Hispanic majorities, like Miami, which is very unique. Among Asians, it's really uncommon. I mean, I know a lot of second generation Chinese Americans. They all know Chinese to some extent, but they are also, for example, illiterate in it. It's very common. So it's something that you learn. So maybe it's an ancestral immigrant language. Maybe it's something that you learned because you learned a lot of languages in school. So that would be, for example, I mean, Huli, you complain about your French. We're having this conversation in English. This is not my native language, and it's not your native language. So English is obviously something that everyone practices, but even to some extent, other languages. I mean, I'm pretty sure that if you were not studying engineering, if you were getting a humanistic education, you would practice more, I imagine. And I do know people here, people who are my age or lower, who have a decent command of a third language. And a third language, I should say a third language that is not ancestral to them. So, for example, I know someone who lived in Paris for a couple of years and is trilingual in German, English, and French. Or it might be someone in Sweden who's maybe a few years older than me. Yeah, okay. The first foreign language doesn't count, but you see, the Americans don't even have the first foreign language, and they don't maintain it. So the point is that it's something that the Americans know at a young age. It's not so much generational at this point, I don't think. Maybe to some extent, but it's mostly an age artifact. So the Gen X boomers were. Yeah, okay. I've never even learned C++. So the Gen X boomers learned foreign languages. Okay, I'm not talking about people who are undereducated in any way, shape, or form. These are people with advanced degrees. So they learned a foreign language in college. It's possible they even did a study abroad for a year. It's possible they lived abroad for a little bit, but their knowledge of wherever they lived abroad, which is very likely to have been Europe, is going to be 30 years out of date. Okay, if they're 50, it's something that they did when they were 19. If they're 45, it's something they did when they were 19, so 26 years out of date. So they're going to have very out of date knowledge. It's not like they keep reading the news of the country that they live in. I mean, look at me. I mean, it's not like I kept reading Swedish news after I left Sweden. I mean, I also would not read them in Swedish. I would read them in English, or I would talk to people about it. But I mean, so at this point, my knowledge of Swedish current events comes from a network of immigrants to Sweden who I know for other reasons. And likewise, my knowledge of things in France. I mean, in France, I poke around a little bit more, especially when it comes to trains, but it comes from people from like a network of Twitter people who either live in France or used to and still have connections there. So it's not something that is that easy to maintain. And I say this as someone who could have yeah, same thing. And I say this as someone someone whose French is good enough to read newspapers. And I don't just mean read newspapers to find construction costs. Like I can read Le Monde. I don't do this very often because I mostly get my news from Twitter links and not from one specific newspaper. But I can read French. Okay, I can have a conversation with a monolingual French person. It's unlikely that I will have a conversation with a monolingual French person and a bilingual French English person. I will talk to in English. But even like two and a half years past living in France. I mean, I have that thing, but I don't know. Is it something that's staying in 20 years? I don't know. I mean, especially 20 years if I don't have any connections with France. So the foreign knowledge of, again, the Gen X boomers, so people who are, let's say, 45, 50, is a generation out of date at this point. So that kind of sanity check that let's look at what other people do, that isn't there for them. And with high-speed rail specifically, it's something that became kind of a national fascination around 2008, 2009, 2010. So in 2008, 2009, 2010, that's already, we're talking about millennials because, I mean, the lower boundary of millennials is what, early 80s? So these are people who would have been 26, 27, so starting to transition toward being boomers. already. So like this is the sort of age in which you still can absorb new knowledge, but it's already in decline. So the result is that the sort of people who are a generation out of date are not going to update based on things that only go back to the Obama era, and they ask for reforms that they in some cases got in the Obama era, and those reforms didn't work. For example, abolishing the cost effectiveness index, instead of what people are talking about now, which is kind of modifying it to be more sensitive to off-peak ridership, but at the time it was just about peak commutes and about time saved, and it was not dynamic with frequency. I don't think. I know it was not. I know it was. I think maybe they were trying to, but it was not seriously dynamic with the fact that if you don't build transit, people will eventually get cars and leave the city, as happened literally anywhere in America that didn't build a subway. To the point that even maintaining ridership, as happened with the Portland Light Rail, is non-zero ridership. So there were some problems with the Bush era cost effectiveness index, by the way, and reformers from that era didn't like it because they kind of understood that the numbers it spat out were bad, but so they didn't maybe understand where they didn't have good enough numbers to replace it with, so they just scrapped it and led to the funding of a lot of cost ineffective things in the Obama era. Continuing to today, if BART to San Jose, for example, ever gets money, which probably will. I doubt it. I mean, I've been trying to get it defunded, but I don't think that many people listen. I don't think that many people listen to me, unfortunately, in America. So the point is that you have this bad thing, which is SOGR. So remember, it is bad. It is thought to be good, partly because of the success in New York in the 1890s, not 1890s, in 1980s and 90s, which has not occurred and has in fact gone in reverse. And moreover, this incorrect belief persists because it empowers incompetent or dishonest and always opaque actors within advocacy and within agency management, as well as within politics. Politicians, too, get embarrassed when they promise something and it doesn't happen. Result, they never promise anything that can go wrong. Result, they don't do anything. So this is the main problem with SOGR. And it's also the main thing with spending money on things that cannot be verified by the common writer. Bear in mind, even things that are really wonky regarding engineering, so switch fixing, the average writer doesn't know what a tangential switch is. I mean, I also think that way too many people who run public transit systems who should know this in the United States don't know what a tangential switch is, but passengers can tell that the trains are faster. Passengers can tell the trains are more reliable. Passengers can tell the trains are more comfortable. And if you say, okay, this is going to be our schedule in the future, Swiss style, passengers can see that you're meeting the schedule. Or if you're saying that you can almost, that maybe you promised 10 things and you managed to get 8 of them done, but not 2. People can be remarkably tolerant of this, but those 8 out of 10 things need to actually be working. And politicians and their appointees and court advocates who, or court think tank pseudo-intellectuals who've given up on this can very easily recommend something that they think works but doesn't, but empowers all those people who just can't deliver. Isn't what Cuomo said with Moynihan, state of good repair? Yeah, no, Moynihan. Okay, so first of all, Moynihan is not a Cuomo project. I mean, Cuomo took credit. Moynihan predates it. Moynihan predates him. Moynihan was a local booster, something that looks nice but doesn't achieve much project. Coming from boomers or even older than boomers. I mean, it comes from, so in general, when you have a really dysfunctional community, especially one with decline, for example, or I shouldn't say decline, I should say stagnation. Something very stagnant. Places that are stagnant or in relative decline tend to look to the past. So in New York, that would be the old Penn Station. So whenever you hear someone talk about generational trauma, you should know that either that person or literally everyone around them is bad at their job. So in this case, it's New York's generational trauma about the replacement of the old Penn Station with Madison Square Garden. And so they wanted to do something that is a pantomime of the old station, and the old station itself was a pantomime of good transit. It's not even a good train station based on modern as opposed to 1900s or 1910 understanding of good operations. And so that is why and this is not Cuomo. This is on New York City at large, not on Cuomo. Cuomo is doing other terrible things that don't achieve anything. For example, Penn Station South is something that he advocates strongly for, and against Gateway, which is by far the more useful of the two projects. It's not even by far. It's infinitely more useful because Penn Station South. So, for people who don't follow American or New York infrastructure or don't watch all those many videos, so this is so here there's no difference. It's just north is Carter. Here, Penn Station to Queens, there are 4 tracks, mostly used by the Long Island Railroad. So it's mostly not trains going like this. Right now, it's only Amtrak, and it's maybe once a day. Not once a day. It's once an hour. And they're planning on something called Penn Station Access. So there would be commuter trains going on this a few times per hour. Most of these trains go like this on the LIRR. And it's 4 tracks. And but here, going west, there's only 2 tracks. The inbound track at morning rush hour has about 25 trains an hour. It's the busiest in the United States. There aren't that many things busier than it on the main line in Europe. There do exist things, Munich S-Bahn, for example, but not many. So they're trying to 4-track this. This is not going to be, it's not literally parallel. It's something that looks like this. I think they want to do a lot of separation, but it's going to hook back into Penn Station. This is called Gateway. And Penn Station South is people who incorrectly think that Penn Station needs more station tracks. So they plan to take this block, 30 to 31st, and knock down the buildings in order to build more station tracks. Cost is measured in many billions. I think maybe 7 billion. It is a project with 0 transportation benefits. Gateway, the Bear Tunnel is, I think they said 11, but it's not 11. It's more like 10. And that is too expensive. It shouldn't be 10. It should be 2. But it's 10 that's useful to some extent. Maybe not enough to justify 10, but still useful. This is 7, I believe, with no benefits whatsoever. Cuomo wants this. He doesn't want this. This is an Amtrak project. What? When the Chief Moynihan engineer committed suicide or something? I mean, because of the pressure? I wouldn't even blame Cuomo for that. I mean, Cuomo murdered 60,000 people because of Corona. The engineer, that's not him, I don't think. Why is it called programmable? It's just New York City subway. By the way, are there other do people have any questions either about SOGR or about related things? Because at 8 and a bit, I do want to stop this. I try to avoid having videos that are longer than 2 hours. Yeah. So Cuomo puts people under immense pressure to meet deadlines, and Cuomo is a terrible boss. Don't get me wrong, okay? But But unfortunately, this is not the worst thing about him. The fact that he's somehow worse than, let's say, than throwing binders at his staffers the way Senator Klobuchar did, that is terrible. Klobuchar is a better human being than Cuomo, okay? Klobuchar is incredibly petty. Cuomo is incredibly petty, but A, is worse, and B, he also killed 60,000 people due to Corona in New York. Okay, so I'm gonna give people a couple more minutes. I mean, if nobody says anything, I'll probably shut this at 8, and it is 7:57. Um, but again, I can stay in chat for a little bit more, but not for again, not for that much longer. What would I recommend for systems that have a maintenance backlog? Um, Fix the backlog. It is never going to take as much money as you're saying it does. I mean, remember, a dollar spent on maintenance, on preventive maintenance, does prevent more money from being spent later. I mean, there is a payback period. There is a payback to spending on maintenance, but the payback isn't remotely close to what the backlog is stated to be but by malefactors like Joe Boardman. Okay, it's not gonna save you 10x within a few years. Um, and if you have a maintenance backlog, what you should do is give the exact figure, give a list of things, and give a list of actionable things that can improve as the backlog shrinks, and report ideally annually, showing that the backlog is indeed shrinking. Um, Yeah, so this is a common thing where you have where you don't replace something and then all the spare parts are no longer being made. Just replace things. I mean, and that's usually sold as a bunch of different things. And the more you try to sell it as SOGR, the less likely it's going to lead to any improvement. For example, the LIR and Metrons especially have. I mean, they're getting somehow they have, because they try to argue their way out of the positive train control mandate. They've landed on the most expensive and least useful positive train control installation. And so I'm a lot less familiar with how signal installation works on Stadtland systems than I am on full rapid transit. But actually, it's interesting that Mülheim wants to substitute the trams on maintenance grounds because the operating costs of buses are just so much higher. Are the trams just so empty that that a tram gets replaced by one bus? Because usually a tram gets replaced by like three buses. Yeah, okay, then ask for a signaling upgrade. A signaling upgrade, if you're actually willing to say, okay, we are going to see the trains run faster, that's a thing. In Paris, when they automated the trains, first of all, it's a cut in operating costs. I mean, it's a phantom cut because they didn't actually lay off the workers; they reassigned them to unnecessary jobs. But they did make the trains faster and more frequent. So again, visible improvement from automation. Um, so again, very different from someone saying we have a maintenance backlog and not specifying what it is and not having any basic accountability showing that the maintenance backlog indeed shrinks every year due to the state of good repair program. Um, and yeah, the fact that Essen can't afford anything is a separate issue. I can't tell whether it's Essen or the entire state. I imagine the state could fund that. But remember, where I live, there's no distinction between the state and the municipality. So for us, it's all the same. Wait, they didn't. I mean, wait. They had an old signaling system. What did they replace it with that it didn't do anything better? I mean, are they just not capacity constrained, so it didn't matter, or or were there no way to, or was it not going to speed up trains or something? Because usually, more modern signals automatically get more reliable. I mean, New York can do bullshit things like how it slowed down the L with the installation of CBTC, but I think with the 7, they're gonna not do that, for which I credit Byford. And they're going to actually speed up the trains a little bit with CBTC. Um, Again, I know that in Paris, the trains actually do speed up to actually a recognizable extent when they get automated. Um, so yeah, there are. So this is not SOGR. So remember, Byford did not say SOGR. Byford said saving precious seconds or saving safe seconds. I think. I never remember the exact words used, but but Byford promised speed and delivered speed. Biden promised not Biden, Byford promised something very specific. He didn't talk about backlog in general. He asked for an improvement that was very cheap because it was only about changing the flagging issue more than anything. Okay, yeah, the state claims they have no money. Okay, am I correct in interpreting when I'm saying Laschet claims he has no money for cities that vote SPD, or am I too conspiratorial? Yeah, so Byford promised improvements in speed and reliability. I can't judge the reliability benefits. I know that the speed benefits happened. Yeah, OTP. Um, so OTP is something that I do not know to what. Oh, huh, interesting. So the OTP thing is something that I tend not to look at very much because they just pad before the last station usually. But I know it's an important metric, but I do not know to what extent passengers care. So I don't know to what extent high OTP matches passengers' perception of reliability. Um, there are really weird ways doing it. Things like excess travel time or something like that, or uh, and it's always weird when you have a really highly branched system, and trying to do it by metrics always leads to managers causing more problems than they solve by walking through the control center saying this looks weird to me, even though this isn't working as it should be, and then ordering the system slow down. Oh, Essen Mülheim is wait, is there just one trunk line that's 6 TPH, or is it just one branch on a trunk that's 6? And then the entire trunk maybe is 12 or something. But it's interesting that there's no speed benefit from resignaling, because it is something that does exist on full subways. Yeah, yeah. Um, okay, so if you have a branch where trains run every 10 minutes, I mean, it's annoying, but I mean, it interlines with a trunk, right? And then on the trunk, you want more frequency. Yeah, and if it makes it more reliable, then it's fine. But I mean, it needs to be noticeable improvements in reliability. And the problem is, it's very easy to. So one of the ways that OTP is not very good for reliability is its end station padding, especially when the schedules just get slowed down. So they're as variable as before, but technically they are said to be more on time. So the insiders all congratulate themselves, and then passengers don't notice any difference. But the insiders get to congratulate themselves and berate the passengers for being stupid, because these are the sort of managers who think that the manager is always right, the worker sometimes is right, the customer is always wrong. Yeah, not shutting down service is noticeable, but I mean, the question is not do you shut down or do you not shut down? The question is what happens after the upgrade? I mean, is it something that passengers will notice things are getting better, or is it going to be people, or is it going to be the create or saved jobs racket, or the create or save housing racket that is so often? So is it U18, Huli? Hilo, Huli? Under Mülheim Hauptbahnhof. Yeah, because this is a line that I guess is subway both in Mülheim and in Essen. Um, I can't even tell which, and like they're all parallel, right? But it's two trunk lines here, I think. Um, by the way, are there any other questions? Oh, under Essen Hauptbahnhof. Okay. But it's also underground in Mülheim a little bit, right? I mean, this doesn't look like it's great. Yeah, this. Yeah, I'm not seeing tracks here. Yeah, it's underground here. Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, I still don't get why they don't just merge all of like why they don't just run everything at the land level if it's like basically one metropolitan area. All of this. I mean, if you want, you can give autonomy to Minster or something. We all I mean we all know all the major cities of NRW, right? We have Köln, Bonn, Düsseldorf, Duisburg, Wuppertal, Essen, Dortmund. Um, we have Bochum, we have Hagen, we have no we you have Münster, Hahn, Paderborn, Detmold, all the major cities of Nordrhein-Westfalen. I don't think I missed any. I guess Krefeld or something. Krefeld or Mönchengladbach. Oh, Aachen. Aachen. Yeah. But like in the east, I know I didn't miss any. Right, it's just Detmold, Paderborn. Wait, what's easy? Running everything at the state level? Yeah, but I mean, yeah, but I mean, sure, but I don't. But it's not like there's a metropolitan Essen with like Gelsenkirchen and Mülheim and Oberhausen that is distinct from everything else because it is contiguous to Bochum and Dortmund, and it is contiguous with Duisburg. Um, and along the Rhine, it is basically contiguous with Düsseldorf and then Wuppertal and then Köln, Bonn, and then Köln and Bonn. Um, I mean, there are gaps, but I mean, there are gaps between Frankfurt and cities that are very clearly suburbs of Frankfurt. Are there gaps with farms? Because so let's see. We start from Essen. All of this is built up, and I mean, there's. I can't tell if it's park or farms, but I mean, either going north or going from the track south. This is taking us to Mülheim. Then we have this area. Okay, there's a little park that separates Mülheim Moning with Zoologischer Garten in Duisburg. Okay. Um, but if you go north, then you might even be able to skip that because port facilities, what all of this is built up. Not especially densely built up, but built up. This is industrial, it counts. Um, and then yeah, so we do have a way of getting from Mülheim. Again, it's not the direct thing because the direct route does have a short undeveloped area, which is tramway station to tramway station, a kilometer. Yeah, this is contiguous. I'm sorry, Hootie. Um, A40. I mean, sure, but um, okay. I mean, yeah. I mean, A4. I mean, the thing is, A4. So if it's so remember that the rural area um, was already kind of a contiguous urban zone already in the 1920s and 30s. So the autobahns would have been going around the margins. So this is why, like, one of the very few rural gaps is contiguous with a autobahn here, for example. But if you look at the other side, it's literally all built up. Um, and then, yeah, they also found a gap in urbanization here. But if you go elsewhere, that gap doesn't exist because along the so maybe not along the railway, but along but along the tramway is it's more developed and there's a very small gap. And if you go farther north through like random industrial zones, there's no gap at all. Um, like it's useful to look at the trams or maybe very short range S-bonds because they're likely to be the gray fingers, not the green ones, not the green things between the fingers, if that makes sense. Um, Krefeld is contiguous with Duisburg. Um, yeah, Düsseldorf might have a bigger gap in urbanization, but it's not a big gap, right? Because again, if it's an autobahn, then it's likely going to go through gaps. But over here, so for example, this is a pretty small gap. I guess it doesn't take you all the way because this is a gap here. But over here, Duisburg Süd, um, all of this is contiguous. Here, okay, there's a farm. It's like this is like another kilometer's worth of gap. Yeah, it's less than a kilometer. It's 500 something meters. And here you're already Düsseldorf. Um, and yeah, you need to hop another gap, but okay, it's a little bit more than a kilometer of gap. I apologize. And then you're just in a finger on the Stadtbahn line from Düsseldorf, from the center of Düsseldorf. Yeah, I mean, relief areas from industry because clearly having like a few hobby farms where the soil is probably polluted anyway is clearly the way to uh, fix urban pollution or whatever. I mean, anti-urbanism is unfortunately not a purely Anglospheric thing. Um, sure, thanks for watching. I'm going to ask for questions one last time, and if there aren't any, I will stop this. Yeah, okay, with 1920s tech, sure, but it's not the 1920s anymore. They can just pave it over. It's fine. I mean, I don't know if there's a lot of demand for these specific rural gaps, to be honest. But I mean, nothing that 300 million Germans wouldn't fix. Anyway, sure. Thanks, guys. So next week, so join me again next week. The topic will be construction costs. Going back to construction costs. I think the thing that I write about that people are most interested in. So thanks, and see you again maybe tomorrow if you want to watch me play GeoGuessr and not be very good at it, or in a week for talking about construction costs. So ciao, ciao.